"Your clothes are getting everything dirty. Get out," shouted the millionaire CEO of the luxury dealership, humiliating the old farmer who was looking at the cars. Judging him by the mud on his boots, he kicked him out in front of all the customers. The farmer, without saying a word, just put his old, worn briefcase on the marble counter and opened it. The CEO looked inside, expecting to find fruits or tools, but what he saw made him go pale and go into complete shock. The white marble floor of the Empire Motors dealership in Manhattan gleamed with an almost surgical splendor. Every inch of the showroom was a reflection of the man who commanded it, J.R., the millionaire CEO who had inherited not only the business, but also his father's obsession with perfection. He hated anything out of place, any stain on the image of opulence the brand represented. The family fortune, built over decades of risky deals and calculated investments, depended on this impeccable facade. The afternoon was unfolding in its usual, predictable and profitable way, the central air whispering promises of comfort and status, when the automatic glass doors slid open, bringing with them an affront to that sanctuary of luxury. It was Abel Truman, a farmer of simple appearance, whose work clothes were stained with the dark soil of the plains and whose thick, worn boots left a subtle trail of dry mud with every step. The man ignored the sidelong glances of the other clients and the salesmen in tailored suits walking directly toward the jewel of the showroom, a red sports car whose price could feed a small town for a year. For J.R., this was more than an inconvenience, it was a personal insult. The wealth he managed was sacred, and this man's presence was a desecration. Cold, cutting fury shot up his spine. He marched across the showroom, his Italian loafers echoing with authority on the marble. "Sir," his voice was a whip, "you're tracking dirt all over my floor. I must ask you to leave, immediately. This establishment isn't for your kind." The humiliation was public, calculated to be an example. The other clients, men and women dressed in the finest designer labels, some with vast holdings in stocks and other assets, watched with a mixture of contempt and embarrassment. A younger salesman made a move to approach, but J.R. froze him with a glare. "Security!" he bellowed, the sound reverberating through the hushed environment. "Get this man out of here now!" The security guard, a burly man, approached reluctantly, but the farmer, with a calm that diffused the tension and irritated the CEO even more, raised a weathered, calloused hand, motioning for him to wait. There was a dignity in his gesture that silenced the room. Without a word, Abel Truman turned and walked slowly to the main counter, his old cracked leather briefcase swinging at his side. He placed it on the polished glass with a dull thud, the sound profane in the reverent silence. J.R., following him, crossed his arms, a sneer on his lips. "What's this?" he mocked. "Going to try and pay me with chickens? Maybe you've got a few sacks of corn in there for a down payment." The briefcase opened with a dry snap. J.R.'s jaw dropped. Inside, there was no cash, no checkbooks. It was crammed with bundles of promissory notes, old contracts tied with twine, and resting on top of it all, a single land deed, yellowed with age. "You don't recognize me, do you, Mr. J.R.E.?" the farmer said, his voice steady, carrying an authority that didn't come from expensive suits, but from the land itself. "I'm Abel Truman. Do you know who I am?" J.R., confused and suddenly insecure, glanced at the dealership manager, who had approached and was now as pale as the marble beneath his feet. The manager whispered, his voice trembling with dread, "Sir, that's the Cattle King. He's the biggest landowner in the entire Midwest. He owns the land under every single one of our Heartland dealerships." J.R.'s sneer vanished, replaced by a mask of pure shock. Abel pulled the deed from the briefcase and slapped it on the counter. "Indeed, I came to do business. The lease agreements on all your locations expired today, and after this reception," he glanced around at the luxury, at the frightened faces, "I've decided I won't be renewing. You have 30 days to get all your luxury cars off my land. JR's world didn't collapse with a bang, but with the deafening silence that followed Abel's words. The air, once rarefied and exclusive, now felt heavy, thick with a humiliation that had switched its target. The clients, who moments before had been accomplices in his disdain, now averted their eyes, some with a poorly disguised spark of satisfaction, others with the discomfort of witnessing a titan's fall. J.R.'s sneer froze on his lips, a grotesque mask of arrogance that slowly crumbled, revealing the raw panic underneath. His mind, always agile at calculating profits and dividends, now struggled to process the magnitude of the catastrophe. The manager's words, Henderson's words, echoed in his head. The biggest landowner in the entire Midwest. He wasn't just a farmer. He was the very foundation upon which his father's empire had expanded, a foundation he, in his hubris, had just dynamited. Abel Truman, with the same unshakable serenity with which he had entered, collected the yellow deed, placing it back in the battered briefcase. He closed it with a click that sounded like a verdict in the silent showroom. His eyes, small and piercing, met J.R.'s one last time, not with anger, but with a cold finality, the look of a man who has made an irrevocable decision. Then he turned and walked toward the exit. The glass doors slid open for him, and he was gone, leaving behind the trail of dry mud on the white marble and the ruin of an empire. The vacuum left by his departure was filled with whispers. The clients began to disperse, eager to leave the charged atmosphere. The salesman remained paralyzed, looking at J.R., waiting for an order, an explosion, anything to break the spell. J.R. finally moved. His breath returned in a gasp, and with it a blind fury. But it wasn't directed at Abel, who was already out of his reach. It was a desperate fury, the rage of a cornered animal. He grabbed Henderson by the arm, the force of his grip making the manager flinch. "My office. Now!" he hissed, dragging the pale man across the showroom, ignoring the curious stares. As they entered the sumptuous glass office on the mezzanine, J.R. slammed the door shut. "Explain. What is this story? What land?" Henderson, trembling, stammered. "Sir, your father. He made the deals over 30 years ago. It was the best investment at the time, leasing Mr. Truman's land instead of buying. The initial capital outlay was much lower. It allowed for rapid expansion. How many?" J.R. cut him off, his voice harsh. "How many dealerships are on his land?" Henderson swallowed hard. "All of them, sir. All 10 of our Heartland branches, the most profitable ones. They represent the bulk of our fixed assets." J.R. felt the floor disappear from under him. Those dealerships weren't just sales points. They were the backbone of his entire cash flow, the source of the wealth that sustained the luxury of the flagship store and his own extravagant habits. He turned to the wall of his office, where a huge map of the United States was adorned with golden pins, each marking an Empire Motors dealership. There was a dense cluster of pins glittering over the richest agricultural regions. Abel Truman's land. Suddenly, the map that had always represented his power and success transformed into a testament to his vulnerability. Each golden pin was now a nail in his coffin. The manager, seeing the expression on his boss's face, added in a near inaudible voice, full of dread, "Sir, without the revenue from those stores, our assets won't cover our liabilities in 6 months. The company, it will go bankrupt." Henderson's phrase, "the company will go bankrupt," hung in the room like a death sentence. For a long moment, J.R. couldn't breathe. He, who masterfully navigated the volatile world of the stock market, who understood cryptocurrency and diversified his personal wealth in gold and offshore accounts, was being annihilated by a man with dirt on his shoes. The irony was crushing. He looked at Henderson. The manager's face twisted into a mask of panic and desperate loyalty. With a sharp gesture, J.R. dismissed him. "Get out. Leave me alone." The manager practically fled, closing the door softly behind him as if afraid of shattering his boss's fragile control. Alone, J.R. walked to the immense window of his office, which offered a panoramic view of Manhattan. The city stretched out below him, a testament to power and wealth, a world he had always believed he ruled. Now it seemed to mock him. All his fortune, his assets, his carefully managed holdings, suddenly felt ethereal, as fragile as glass. The initial denial gave way to an icy rage. It wasn't possible. Men like him were not destroyed by men like Abel. Problems were solved with money, with power, with the best lawyers capital could buy. He picked up his phone, his hand trembling slightly, and dialed the number of his top lawyer, Sterling, a man whose profitability was measured in impossible cases won. "Sterling," J.R. said without preamble, "I need you to find every loophole, every misplaced comma in the lease agreements for our Heartland dealerships. The owner is named Abel Truman." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Truman," Sterling repeated, his tone suddenly cautious. "J.R., those are old contracts. Your father signed them. Back then, those deals were practically sacred, built on trust. Legally, they're ironclad. What happened?" J.R. narrated an edited version of the events, painting himself as the victim of an eccentric old man. "I don't care what it costs," he concluded. "Use every resource. I will not be evicted from my own stores." Sterling sighed, an expensive, discouraging sound. "I'll look into it, J.R., but don't get your hopes up. If the renewal deadline has passed and he doesn't want to renew legally, his position is rock solid." J.R. hung up, frustration burning in his chest. The feeling of helplessness was a poison he had never tasted. He, who had turned his father's inheritance into a multi-million-dollar net worth, was utterly powerless. He paced his office, his mind racing with numbers, liabilities, and the imminent collapse of his cash flow. It was then that his private phone rang, displaying a picture he hadn't seen in months. His father, Ricardo. A chill ran down his spine. Ricardo lived in seclusion on his ranch since retiring, but his shadow still loomed over Empire Motors. "Dad," J.R. answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Henderson called me," Ricardo said, his voice devoid of emotion, which was worse than anger. "He sounded worried. Said we had a problem with one of our landowners. Said you threw him out of the store." J.R. felt his blood run cold. "It was a misunderstanding, Dad. Some random farmer acting inappropriately. I'm handling it with the lawyers." "A random farmer," Ricardo repeated, and for the first time, J.R. detected a strange note in his voice, something that resembled an old pain. "What's his name?" "J.R." The question was direct, leaving no room for evasion. J.R. swallowed, the knot in his throat tightening. "His name is Abel Truman." A deep silence settled on the line, a silence so long and heavy that J.R. thought the call had dropped. When Ricardo finally spoke, his voice was a hoarse whisper, laden with the weight of decades. "You didn't do that, J.R. You don't know who he is, do you? Abel Truman. He was the best man at my wedding. The best man at my wedding." His father's words shot through the phone line and hit J.R. with the force of a punch to the gut. The air rushed out of his lungs. The world, which was already tilting, spun violently. He leaned against the mahogany desk, his knuckles white, his breath caught in his throat. Best man. The words seemed to belong to a parallel universe, a world of emotional ties and shared histories he barely knew. His life was made of contracts, of assets and liabilities, of capital that grew with the coldness of numbers. That phrase, however, carried a weight that no spreadsheet could calculate. It was the weight of history, of loyalty, of honor, a weight he had trampled on with his Italian leather shoes. You never told me," J.R. stammered, the accusation weak, childish. "You never told me about him." On the other end of the line, Ricardo let out a weary sigh, the sound of a man watching his greatest fears come to life. Tell you what, J.R., that our empire, our legacy, was built on the trust of a good man, that Abel leased me that land when I had nothing, just a dream and a firm handshake. He believed in me when the banks wouldn't. He gave us the breathing room to start. Empire Motors wasn't born from a huge cash investment. It was born from an investment in character, capital that isn't measured in dollars or euros, but in a man's word. And you spit in his face. Ricardo's voice wasn't angry, but filled with a disappointment so deep it cut more than any shout. Each word was a shovelful of dirt on J.R.'s pride. Burying him alive, J.R. tried to compose himself, forcing his mind back to the territory he knew, business. Dad, that's sentimentalism. We're talking about the collapse of our net worth. I can fix this. I'll offer him a new contract, higher rates, a better return. I'll double the lease payment. Every man has his price. The suggestion, which in any other situation would have been a masterstroke, sounded hollow and vulgar in the ensuing silence. Ricardo laughed, but it was a joyless, broken sound. You still don't get it, do you? For men like Abel, dignity isn't for sale. Honor isn't traded on the stock exchange. He doesn't want your money, J.R. He wanted respect, the respect you denied him in front of everyone. J.R. felt like a stranger in his own family's history. There was an entire chapter, the most important one, that had been omitted. He was the heir to a fortune, but an ignoramus about the true wealth that had originated it. So what do I do?" he asked, his arrogance finally cracking, giving way to a thread of desperation. "Send the lawyers to apologize. Mail a letter." His father's reply was immediate, his voice now hard as steel, the voice of the founder who built everything from nothing. "You won't send lawyers. You won't offer more money. You're going to do something you haven't done in a long time. You're going to act like a man, not a balance sheet." The order came, clear and non-negotiable, a sentence that sealed his fate. "Tomorrow at sunrise, you will get in your car, not the driver, you, and you will drive to his farm in Nebraska, and you will beg for his forgiveness, not for the business, J.R., for the honor of our family, and you don't come back to New York until he forgives you." The line went dead. J.R. stood there, the silent phone in his hand, staring at the city that no longer belonged to him. With the impossible task of rebuilding a bridge he himself had set on fire, the night was torture. J.R., locked in his penthouse, floating above the sea of lights of Manhattan, found no peace. Sleep, which had always been a mere item on his efficiency schedule, now eluded him. He paced back and forth on the Persian rug, the silence of the luxury apartment amplifying the chaos in his mind. Every light of the city below seemed like a judging eye. The reflection in the window showed not the billionaire in control of his destiny, but a man trapped by his own arrogance. His father's order was a shackle, a humiliation far deeper than the one he had inflicted on Abel. He, who commanded vast wealth and made decisions that moved millions, had been reduced to an errand boy, sent on a mission of penance. Rage simmered within him, an impotent fury against his father, against Abel, and most of all, against himself for falling into such a primitive trap. The sun rose, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple that J.R. never noticed. He hadn't slept. With the resignation of a condemned man, he moved. He took a cold, mechanical shower and dressed. He chose a pair of designer chinos and a dark polo shirt, which in his world was the height of casual wear. He looked at the gold watch on his wrist, a symbol of his success, and for a moment, he wanted to hurl it against the wall. He went down to the subterranean garage, a pantheon of powerful engines and sleek designs. He ignored the red sports car, now a monument to his stupidity, and chose a black SUV, robust and imposing, It was a fortress on wheels, a piece of his world he would take into enemy territory. Without informing his secretary, without speaking to anyone, he sped out of the city, the roar of the engine a cry of frustration. The transition was gradual, but brutal. The grey concrete of Manhattan gave way to the asphalt of the interstate, which in turn narrowed into two-lane highways. The urban landscape, with its right angles and cold logic, dissolved into a blur of green and brown. J.R. drove with his hands clenched on the steering wheel, his mind a whirlwind of useless calculations. He thought about the contracts, the loss of profit, the devastating impact on his assets. He tried to quantify the disaster, to turn it into numbers he could understand and, perhaps, control. But his father's words haunted him: honor, character, trust. They were abstract concepts, immeasurable, that didn't fit into any of his financial models. For him, the only investment that mattered was one with a tangible return. The idea that the foundation of all his wealth rested on something as ethereal as a man's word was maddening. The GPS voice, cold and digital, pulled him from his thoughts, instructing him to turn onto a dirt road. The dark, rich soil, the same kind that had stained Abel's clothes. The luxury SUV, designed for the perfect pavement of the metropolis, protested, shaking and rattling over the ruts. A fine brown dust began to coat the gleaming black paint, violating its perfection, staining his symbol of power. Every jolt was a reminder of his descent, of his journey into a world he despised. The air conditioning maintained the scent of new leather, but through the window he could smell the earth, the vegetation, the real life he had always strived to keep at a distance. Fear, a feeling he rarely admitted to, began to seep through his defenses. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he saw it. A simple wooden gate with a small, almost childish, hand-painted sign, Truman Farms. That was it. No ostentation, no sign of the immense fortune that place represented. The home of the Cattle King was modest, almost humble. J.R. stopped the car, the engine humming in the country silence. He looked at the gate, at the long dirt road leading to a simple farmhouse in the distance. This was his arena, the stage for his surrender. He took a deep breath, preparing for the final act of his humiliation, and opened the car door. It was then that, emerging from a small grove of cottonwood trees, a young woman appeared, mounted on a sorrel horse. She rode with a natural confidence, her dark hair tied back in a ponytail. As she approached the gate, she stopped, and her eyes, the same piercing eyes as Abel Truman's, fixed on his, a look that mixed curiosity with a suspicion as old as the land itself. The woman on the horse watched him in silence, and under that steady gaze, J.R. felt, for the first time in his adult life, completely sized up and found wanting. There was no deference in her posture, no admiration for the expensive SUV or the designer clothes. There was only a cold neutrality that was somehow more intimidating than open hostility. She dismounted with a fluidity that spoke of a lifetime of practice, the horse remaining quiet at her side. Up close, he noticed she wasn't as young as she had seemed from a distance. She must have been in her early 30s, with sun-kissed skin and small lines around her eyes that were the spitting image of her grandfather's. "Lost?" she asked, her voice clear and without inflection. It wasn't an offer of help, it was a challenge. "I'm looking for Mr. Abel Truman," J.R. replied, forcing a tone of authority that sounded fake even to his own ears. "I have an urgent matter to discuss with him." The woman crossed her arms, the gesture skeptical. "My grandfather isn't seeing visitors today, especially not ones who arrive in cars that cost more than a year's harvest." The sarcasm was subtle, but sharp as glass. The mention of grandfather confirmed the connection. J.R. felt a wave of frustration. He didn't have time to be stonewalled by a farmer's granddaughter. The future of his business, his legacy, was at stake. "Listen," he said, taking a step forward. "This is an extremely important business matter. It involves considerable capital and the future of many people." He used the words that always worked in his world, the keys that opened every door. Business, capital, future. She didn't even blink. Out here, the future of many people depends on the rain, not on men in suits from New York. And the only capital my grandfather respects is a man's word. "Something I hear you're short on." The blow was direct, precise. She knew, of course she knew. The humiliation at the dealership must have become an instant family legend. J.R.'s arrogance dissolved, replaced by a cold desperation. "I need to speak with him," he said, his voice now lower, almost a plea. I came to apologize." The woman studied him for a long moment, her gaze sweeping over him from head to toe. From the now dusty designer shoes to the perfectly styled hair, she seemed to be weighing not his words, but his intent. Finally, she sighed, a sound of resignation, not acceptance. "He's not at the house. He's in the north pasture, checking the fence line by the creek. If you really want to talk to him, you'll have to go to him." She gestured with her chin toward a narrow trail that disappeared into the vegetation. On foot. J.R. looked at the trail, and then at his SUV, the sanctuary of air conditioning and leather seats. The idea of walking under the hot sun on a dirt path was repulsive, but her gaze left no room for negotiation. Swallowing his pride, which now had the bitter taste of dust and defeat, he nodded. "Thank you." She didn't reply, just swung back onto her horse and trotted away, leaving him alone with his humiliation. He started walking. The leather shoes, made for the sidewalks of Manhattan, sank into the soft earth. A branch scratched his designer shirt. The sun beat down on the back of his neck. He, the multi-millionaire, the master of the financial universe, was being forced on a humiliating pilgrimage. Every step was a small death for his ego. After a 20-minute walk, sweating and with his shoes ruined, he finally spotted the creek. And there, his back to him, was Abel. But he wasn't alone. Beside him, with a dusty pickup truck parked nearby, stood another man in a suit and tie, holding a map spread open on the hood. Abel turned slightly, and J.R. could hear his voice, calm and steady, carried on the wind. "So, you're interested in leasing it all 10 properties?" J.R.'s heart stopped. Abel's words, carried on the gentle country breeze, hit him with the force of a hurricane. "Leasing it all 10 properties." He froze, partially hidden by the foliage. The sweat on his back suddenly cold. The man in the suit, whom J.R. could now see more clearly, was a complete stranger, but his posture was unmistakable. It was the posture of a corporate predator, someone who smells a golden opportunity from a mile away. He saw that same air of calculated confidence in the mirror every morning. The stranger nodded vigorously, pointing at the map. "Exactly, Mr. Truman. Our company, Horizon Motors, is in the middle of a major heartland expansion, taking over 10 established commercial points with all the infrastructure ready. It would be an investment with immediate profitability. We're prepared to beat any offer and give you a long-term lease agreement with annual adjustments based on Treasury yields, well above inflation. Horizon Motors." The name echoed in J.R. as mind like a death knell. They were his biggest competitors, an aggressive company, backed by robust foreign capital, that had been trying for years to break Empire Motors' monopoly in the region. They were ruthless, efficient, and now they were about to devour the heart of his empire. Pure, visceral panic took hold of him. This was no longer about begging for forgiveness or saving his family's honor. This was about survival. That man wasn't there by chance. The news of the dispute must have spread like wildfire in the business world. While he had spent the night stewing in his humiliation, his rivals were acting, turning his monumental failure into a stratospheric gain for them. Abel listened to the man patiently, his face inscrutable. He wasn't looking at the map. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, as if pondering something far deeper than interest rates and dividends. "It's a generous proposal, Mr." Abel said, his voice calm. "Mr. Davis," the man supplied, extending a business card. Abel took it, but didn't look at it, slipping it into his shirt pocket. "A generous proposal," he repeated. "But you understand, Mr. Davis, that to me, land isn't just an asset. It's a legacy. It's the memory of my father and his father. The decision of who uses it isn't based solely on the cash flow it can generate." Davis smiled, a polished, condescending smile. Of course, Mr. Truman, I respect your sentiment, but business is business. A lucrative contract can create a new legacy, an even greater financial security for your family, for your granddaughter." It was at that moment that Abel finally turned, and his gaze passed over Davis's shoulder and met J.R.S. standing among the trees. There was no surprise in his eyes, only a silent acknowledgement. He had known J.R. was there the whole time. This meeting hadn't been a coincidence. It was a demonstration of power. Abel was showing J.R., in no uncertain terms, that he was replaceable, that the empire J.R. considered his birthright was in fact a privilege granted, a privilege that was now being offered to his greatest enemy. J.R.'s world, which was already in ruins, imploded. He was no longer the protagonist of this story. He was a mere spectator at the liquidation of his own legacy. The man he had despised and thrown out of his store was now, with terrifying calm, auctioning off his future. Abel took a step forward, leaving Davis behind, and walked slowly toward J.R. Every step the old farmer took on the dark soil was like a nail being hammered into the coffin of Empire Motors. J.R. remained paralyzed, unable to speak, unable to think. The humiliating journey, the walk under the sun, all of it had been merely a prelude to this devastating moment. The real humiliation wasn't being thrown out, but the realization of his total and absolute irrelevance. Abel stopped a few feet from him. His eyes, which in the dealership had seemed merely tired, now shone with a sharp intelligence and an unshakable authority. "Did you come out to the country for a stroll, Mr. J.R.?" he asked, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Or did you come to see how a fortune is unmade with one's own hands?" Abel's words cut through the air, precise and lethal, stripping J.R. of the last layer of his armor. "Did you come to see how a fortune is unmade with one's own hands?" It wasn't a question, it was the conclusion of a diagnosis. Here, under the open sky covered in dust and sweat, J.R. was not the multi-millionaire CEO. He was just the son of an old friend, a young man who had made a catastrophic mistake. Mr. Davis, sensing the shift in dynamics, approached cautiously, the professional smile still on his face, but his eyes glinting with curiosity. "Abel, is there a problem? Do you know this gentleman?" Abel didn't take his eyes off J.R. "I do," he replied, his voice heavy with decades of untold history. "This is J.R., the heir of the man I shook hands with 30 years ago." The word heir was pronounced with a weight that made it a burden, not a privilege. Davis's eyebrows shot up, comprehension dawning on his face. The business world was small. He put the pieces together instantly. The smile on his face widened, now genuine, tinged with triumph. "Ah, yes, Mr. Ricardo, from Empire Motors, a true visionary. It's a shame their business seems to be going through a rough patch." The fake sympathy was a knife twisting in J.R.'s wound. He felt exposed, dissected under the gaze of his rival and the man who held his destiny in his hands. The rage that had once consumed him gave way to a hollow sense of defeat. He opened his mouth to speak, to try and defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? Any argument based on money or assets would be ridiculous at that moment. Any apology would sound false and self-serving. Abel, ignoring Davis's presence, took another step toward J.R. My father used to say that a man isn't measured by the wealth he accumulates, but by the word he keeps. Your father, Ricardo, was a man of his word. He came here with calloused hands and a dream in his eyes. He had no property, no assets. His only capital was his honesty. That's what I invested in. He paused, letting the words sink in. And you, what is your capital, J.R.? The simple question disarmed him completely. J.R. thought of his stocks, his crypto investments, his real estate holdings, but he knew none of those were the right answer. He had no answer. The silence stretched on, filled only by the buzzing of insects and the murmur of the creek. It was then that Abel's granddaughter, whose name he still didn't know, arrived. She wasn't on horseback this time, but on foot, carrying a small basket. She stopped beside her grandfather, placing a protective hand on his arm, her gaze toward J.R., one of pure disapproval. "Grandpa, lunch is almost ready. Don't tire yourself with matters that aren't worth the time." Her loyalty was fierce, an invisible barrier between her grandfather and the outside world. Abel patted her hand. "It's all right, Lucy. Mr. J.R. and I are just having a conversation about the value of business." He turned to Davis. "Mr. Davis, I appreciate your visit and your proposal. I will consider it carefully. My granddaughter will escort you back to the gate." It was a clear dismissal, polite but final. Davis, knowing he had planted the seed, smiled, shook Abel's hand, and shot one last victorious glance at J.R. before following Lucy. Now they were alone. The rival was gone, but the threat remained, more real than ever. Abel walked to the creek and sat on a large, smooth rock in the shade of a cottonwood tree. He looked at the running water, his face pensive. J.R. remained standing, unsure what to do, feeling like an intruder at his own catastrophe. "My father taught me to take care of this land," Abel said, without looking at him. "He used to say we don't own anything, we're just stewards. We spend our lives taking care of the land, the family, the name. What have you been taking care of, J.R.?" The question echoed in the emptiness inside him. He took care of profit, of expansion, of image. But what did that truly mean? For the first time, the foundation of his beliefs began to crack, and he glimpsed the abyss of his own insignificance. He looked at his hands, clean and soft, and then at Abel's, wrinkled and stained with soil, and understood the unbridgeable distance that lay between them. The silence that settled between them was not empty, but filled with the sounds of nature and the weight of unspoken words. J.R., standing under the sun, felt sweat trickling down his back, a physical humiliation that mirrored his internal agony. He looked at Abel, sitting serenely on the rock, and saw not just the man who could destroy his empire, but a living enigma. A man whose value system was so alien to his own that it seemed to come from another planet. "What have you been taking care of, J.R.?" The question continued to reverberate in his mind, systematically dismantling everything he had ever considered important: his net worth, his businesses, his relentless pursuit of more wealth. It all suddenly seemed hollow, devoid of substance. He had been taking care of a shell, while the core, the soul of it all, had eluded him. Finally, he found his voice. Not the arrogant voice of the CEO, but a lower, more hesitant one. I took care of the business. The inheritance my father left me. I multiplied it. I increased the capital, the profitability. I thought that's what I was supposed to do." The confession sounded pathetic to his own ears. Abel turned his head slowly and looked at him. There was a trace of sadness in his eyes. "Your father didn't just leave you a company, J.R. He left you a name he built with sweat and honesty. The company was just the result of that. You took care of the result, but you forgot the source. A tree doesn't live on its fruit alone. It needs strong roots. And the roots of this business, whether you like it or not, are planted in my land and in my trust." He stood up and began to walk slowly along the bank of the creek. and J.R. instinctively followed him like a reluctant disciple. "You know," Abel continued, "when your father first came here, he had an old car that broke down every week and a briefcase full of dreams. He didn't have the money to buy a single plot of land, but he had something worth more than gold. He knew how to listen. He would sit with me under this very cottonwood tree and tell me his plans, but he also listened to me. He asked about the harvest, about my family, about the rains. He didn't see me as an asset to be exploited, but as a person. We didn't sign a contract that day, J.R. We formed a partnership." The word partnership hit J.R. with force. He had never thought of Abel as a partner. To him, the farmer was just a name on a lease agreement, a recurring liability on his cash flow spreadsheet. As they walked, Lucy returned, this time in silence. She kept a respectful distance, but her eyes never left her grandfather, watchful and protective. Her presence was a constant reminder that J.R. was a stranger here, an invader. "I watched you grow up from a distance," Abel said, stopping and turning to face him. "I saw the news in the papers, the stories about the young business prodigy who turned his father's company into a conglomerate. I was proud for Ricardo's sake, but I was also worried, because in all the pictures I saw your eyes. They were the eyes of a man who only looks at numbers, at stock charts, eyes that don't see the people behind the business." The accuracy of the analysis was unnerving. J.R. felt completely naked, every defense, every pretense stripped from him. He was exactly that, a man who had turned people into statistics, relationships into transactions. The humiliation he had inflicted on Abel was not an isolated act of arrogance. It was the natural manifestation of his worldview. "I didn't come here to destroy you, J.R., Abel said, his voice softening slightly. "I came to New York that day to make you a proposal, a new partnership. I wanted to propose a joint investment in a solar energy project on my lands, a way to modernize our ties, to build something new for the future, for Lucy, for your children, if you have them one day. I wanted to look into the eyes of my friend's son and see if the man of his word I once knew still lived in him." The revelation was a punch to J.R.'s solar plexus. The man he had treated like trash hadn't come to take, he had come to offer. He had come with a business opportunity, a future, and in return had received contempt. The enormity of his mistake crushed him. This wasn't just about a 30-day eviction. It was the loss of a future he never even knew existed, a future based not just on profit, but on purpose. Abel's revelation hung in the air, more devastating than any threat. The solar energy project, the proposal of a new partnership. It wasn't just a deal J.R. had destroyed with his arrogance. It was a bridge to a different future, a future he didn't even have the capacity to imagine. His mind, trained to see the world as a series of transactions, of investments and returns, simply couldn't process the dimension of what he had lost. His entire net worth, his assets carefully diversified in funds and stocks, now seemed like children's toys compared to the real wealth Abel had offered him, the wealth of a shared purpose, of a legacy built on land and trust. He had been confronted with an opportunity to transform his inheritance of capital into an inheritance of value, and he had spit it out because of a little mud on his marble floor. "It was a good plan," Abel said, with a melancholy that held no accusation, only the sadness of a lost opportunity. "To use the power of the sun, which blesses this land every day, to generate clean energy, a passive, steady income, much safer than the stock market, because it's based on something real, a business that would do good for the land and for the people. I thought Ricardo's son, who always had vision, would understand." He glanced at Lucy, and in his gaze, J.R. saw the true driver behind the plan. It wasn't about interest or dividends, it was about building a better world for her. "Lucy, sensing her grandfather's vulnerability, interrupted the moment, offering him a bottle of water. "Drink some, Grandpa. The sun is strong." Her look toward J.R. was icy. An apology comes easy when a fortune is at stake. Her words hit him, but he knew they were deserved. Why should they believe in his sudden change of heart? His entire life was evidence to the contrary. And then, like a lightning flash, a memory struck him. He was about 15, and his father had taken him to one of the Heartland dealerships, the first one that had been built. He had complained the whole way, bored, preferring to be in New York with his friends. Ricardo had taken him to the back of the building, where a small orchard had been planted. "Look, son," his father had said, pointing to the trees, "Mr. Truman gave me these saplings. He said every business needs to bear fruit you can eat, not just fruit you can count. Remember that, J.R. Cash flow feeds the company, but kindness feeds the soul." At the time, he had thought it was foolish sentimentality. Now, the memory burned with the shame of his own blindness. He looked up, not at Abel as a businessman, but as a man. The CEO mask fell away, and what remained was just an individual stripped of his certainties. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking, the simple phrase carrying the weight of a lifetime of arrogance. "Not for the business, not for my assets. I'm sorry for the way I treated you, for the humiliation, for disrespecting you and the memory of your friendship with my father. There's no excuse for what I did. I was wrong, completely wrong." The silence that followed was the longest of his life. Lucy stared at him, skeptical. Abel watched him, his face unreadable. J.R. awaited a sentence, a final dismissal, an order to get off his land and out of their lives. He had spoken the truth, and now he was completely vulnerable, with nothing to offer but his belated regret. Abel finally broke the silence. He looked up at the high sun, then back down the trail toward the farmhouse. "Words are wind, J.R.," he said, his voice calm but firm. "They come and go. Actions are what remain." He turned to J.R., his eyes like two probes searching his soul. "It's almost lunchtime. My granddaughter cooked. The food is simple. Farmhouse food." He paused, and J.R.'s world seemed to hold its breath. "Sit at our table, eat our food, and then we'll see if Ricardo's son is still in there somewhere." The walk from the creek to the farmhouse was the longest of J.R.'s life. The silence among the three of them was a physical entity, dense and uncomfortable. Lucy walked a step ahead, like a scout in hostile territory, while Abel walked beside him, his pace slow but steady. J.R. followed, feeling the weight of every glance Lucy cast over her shoulder. He wasn't a guest, he was a prisoner on parole, and lunch was to be his trial. The house was exactly as he'd imagined, and yet completely different. It was simple, white clapboard with blue wooden shutters and an inviting porch out front. But it had a solidity, a sense of belonging to the landscape that none of his luxury properties would ever have. The true asset of this place was not in the deed, but in the generations of lives that had echoed within its walls. They entered through the kitchen, and the smell of home cooking, garlic sautéing, beans simmering, the aroma of cornbread in the oven enveloped him, a sensory assault that disarmed him completely. It was the smell of home, a concept that for him had always been abstract, associated with addresses and asset declarations. The solid wood table was already set, with simple ceramic plates and silverware that, though polished, showed the marks of use. On one wall, black and white photographs told the story of the Truman family. Smiling faces tanned by the sun, generations of men and women of the land. In one photo, he saw a much younger Abel standing next to a man he recognized with a jolt. His father, Ricardo, also young, both of them grinning, arms slung over each other's shoulders. The evidence of that friendship, of that history, was right there, watching him, judging him. They sat in silence. Lucy served the platters, fluffy rice, creamy beans, chicken stew with okra, and a salad of greens picked from the garden he could see through the window. The food was unpretentious, but vibrant, real. J.R. served himself a modest portion, aware that his every move was being scrutinized. The first bite was a revelation. The flavor was intense, authentic, something no five-star restaurant in Manhattan could replicate. It was the taste of the earth, of care, of time. He ate in silence, feeling a profound shame for all the rushed business lunches, for all the expensive dishes he had barely tasted, more concerned with the deals being closed than with the food itself. "Are you used to such simple food, Mr. J.R.?" Lucy asked, the first to break the silence. The question was a spear. J.R. swallowed, raising his eyes to meet hers. "No," he answered, with an honesty that surprised him. "I'm not, and I realize I've missed a lot because of it. This is delicious." The answer seemed to disarm her for a moment. She just nodded, a flicker of uncertainty on her brow. Abel, who until then had just been eating and observing, wiped his mouth with a cloth napkin. "The wealth on this table, J.R., comes from work. Every grain of rice, every leaf of lettuce, required sweat and patience. It's a kind of profit you don't deposit in a bank, but it keeps us alive and strong." He looked at his own hands, then at J.R. "Your hands have never touched the soil, have they?" J.R. looked at his own hands, with their well-manicured, soft nails. The answer was obvious. He shook his head. Abel finished his meal, pushed his plate aside, and stood up. The trial was not over yet. "Finish your food," he said. Then, "I want to show you something outside. A piece of the pasture fence broke in the last rain. It's a job that needs doing." J.R. finished his food hastily, his heart pounding. He followed Abel outside, into the strong afternoon sun. The old farmer led him to a barbed wire fence, where one of the wooden posts had fallen, loosening the wires. Nearby, leaning against a shed, was a set of rustic tools, a post-hole digger, a heavy sledgehammer, a roll of wire. Abel pointed to the fallen post. "Your father helped me put up this fence almost 30 years ago. He had no skill for it, but he had the will. He got his hands dirty." He turned and looked J.R. in the eye, the final ultimatum in his gaze. "If you want to prove to me that your words are more than just wind, pick up those tools. The work is hard, and the sun shows no mercy." Today's world shrank to that small patch of land and the impossible task assigned to him. For an instant, the CEO's brain screamed in protest. It was absurd, humiliating. He could buy this entire farm with a single successful Bitcoin trade. He could hire a crew to rebuild every fence in the state, but he knew, with a terrifying clarity, that none of that mattered. This wasn't a test of his financial power. It was a test of his character, an asset he never knew he needed to possess. He looked at the tools, then at Abel, and finally at his own useless hands. Without a word, he took the gold watch from his wrist and placed it carefully on a clean fence post. Then he stripped off his designer polo shirt, leaving on the white undershirt beneath, and then he picked up the post-hole digger. The weight of the tool surprised him. It was a dead, awkward, brutal weight. His first few strikes on the hard, dry earth were pathetic, kicking up only small puffs of dust. Lucy, watching from the porch, crossed her arms, her expression confirming what she already expected. He would fail. Abel stood motionless like an ancient tree, his face a mask of oak, impenetrable. J.R. felt the humiliation burn on his face, mingling with the first drops of sweat. Frustration washed over him. He wanted to scream, to throw the tool down and leave. But the image of his father, smiling next to Abel in the old photograph, haunted him. The memory of his words, he had no skill for it, but he had the will, echoed in his mind. He kept going, awkward, inefficient, but stubborn. The midday sun was merciless, punishing his unaccustomed skin. Sweat soaked his undershirt, plastering it to his back. The brown dust rose, coating his face, getting in his mouth, staining him with the color of the earth he had always despised. His muscles, used only to the controlled exercises of a luxury gym, screamed in protest. Soon, blisters began to form on his soft hands. First one, then two, and then they broke, the thin skin tearing, leaving raw flesh exposed to the friction of wood and metal. A sharp, searing pain shot up his arms with every strike. He stopped for a moment, panting, looking at the blood mingling with the sweat and dirt on his palms. This was the moment to quit. The rational part of his brain told him to stop this madness. But then he looked at Abel, and for the first time, he didn't see the man who threatened his business. He saw his father's friend, the man who had given him a chance, who had offered him a partnership, who had invited him to his table. He saw a man whose only capital was his word, and whose net worth was his dignity. And in that moment, J.R. understood. He wasn't fixing a fence to save his empire. He was mending himself. With a groan that was part pain and part determination, he gripped the digger again. The skepticism in Lucy's eyes gave way to a quiet bewilderment. Abel didn't move, but J.R. felt something had shifted in the intensity of his gaze. After an eternity, the hole was deep enough. With a superhuman effort, he lifted the new wooden post and set it in place. He was exhausted, dehydrated, the pain in his hands an agony. But the post was steady. He picked up the sledgehammer and then with trembling blows fastened the barbed wire. When the last staple was driven into the wood, he dropped the hammer, which fell with a dull thud to the ground. The job was done. He stood, swaying, his entire body shaking with exhaustion. He was covered in brown dust, which was no longer a stain of humiliation, but a medal of effort. He turned, his breath ragged, and faced Abel. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. His actions, his pain, his bloodied hands were his one true apology. Abel walked slowly toward him, his eyes scanning J.R. from head to toe, then fixing on the crude but completed work on the fence. The old farmer raised his gaze and met J.R.'s eyes, and the silence that followed held the fate of everything he had ever known. The setting sun painted the sky a deep orange, casting long shadows across the land. Abel looked at J.R.'s bloodied hands, at the crudely but solidly mended fence, and then at the young man's face, caked with sweat and brown dust. A long sigh escaped the old farmer's lips, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of 30 years of memories. He stepped closer and, with a gentleness that contradicted his calloused hands, took one of J.R.'s, examining the blisters and cuts. "This is the currency of the land," he said, his voice low and raspy. "It demands its price in sweat and blood, but what it gives in return, no fortune in dollars or euros can buy." He released J. Sartun's hand and looked toward the horizon. "I'm not going to break you, J.R. I won't hand over Ricardo's life's work to men like that Davis, who see nothing but figures." Behind them, the farmhouse door opened. Lucy came down the porch steps, no longer with the gaze of a sentinel, but with an expression of restrained concern. In her hands, she carried a basin of warm water and a small first aid kit. She stopped in front of J.R., avoiding his eyes, and said softly, "Come on, you need to clean those hands before they get infected." J.R., too exhausted to protest, followed her to the porch. He sat on a wooden bench while she, with quiet efficiency, cleaned the dirt and blood from his palms. The touch of her fingers was surprisingly gentle. Every sting of the antiseptic was a reminder of the path he had traveled that day, a journey far longer than the miles separating New York from this farm. "The lease will not be terminated," said Abel, who was watching them from the doorway. "Tomorrow, I'll call Mr. Davis and tell him I've made a different decision." The relief J.R. had expected to feel didn't come. In its place was something deeper. an overwhelming gratitude that left him speechless. He hadn't just saved his business, his net worth, and his assets. He had salvaged something infinitely more valuable, the chance to be a better man. But things won't go back to the way they were, Abel continued, his tone now firm, that of a business partner setting new terms. That proposal I was going to make you in New York, about the solar energy project, it's still on the table, but on one condition. J.R. looked up, his heart in his throat. Lucy finished the bandage, wrapping clean gauze around his hand. What condition? J.R. asked. Abel went inside the house and returned with the old photograph of himself and Ricardo. He handed it to J.R. The condition is that you understand what this photo means. It means our business isn't just about profitability or cash flow. It's about trust. It's about building something that will outlast us. I want you to lead this new investment, but not from your air-conditioned office in Manhattan. I want you to come here once a month. I want you to get your shoes muddy, to talk to the men who will work on the project, to understand that this company's greatest capital isn't in a bank, but in its people. Lucy, standing beside her grandfather, looked at J.R., and for the first time he saw not suspicion in her eyes, but a challenge. The challenge to prove that the change from this one day was not temporary. J.R. looked at the photo, at his father's young smile, at the genuine friendship he had despised. He finally understood the true nature of the inheritance he had received. It was not just a stock portfolio or a series of properties. It was a responsibility. I accept, he said, his voice firm, without hesitation. I accept. He wasn't just accepting a business deal. He was accepting a new path, a new definition of wealth. The sun finally disappeared below the horizon, and in the soft twilight, the mended fence looked like a monument, not to his humiliation, but to his rebirth. A year later, the sun that had once punished J.R. was now the source of his greatest achievement. Where there was once only pasture, dozens of solar panels now shimmered, a sea of glass and silicon drinking in the light and transforming it into clean energy. It was the inauguration day of the Truman Empire Solar Farm, and the air smelled not of luxury and new leather, but of earth damp from the morning rain and barbecue, as the celebration was a community event, not an affair for the Manhattan elite. J.R. was not in a designer suit. He wore jeans, dusty boots, and a simple shirt. He moved among the guests, local farmers, project technicians, their families, not with the distance of a CEO, but with the familiarity of a neighbor. He knew the men by name, asked about their crops, laughed at their jokes. The transformation that had begun with bloodied hands had solidified into a new way of being. Across the yard, Abel, leaning on his cane, was talking with Ricardo J. Arceus's father, who rarely left his ranch, had made a point of being there. There was a quiet pride in his eyes as he watched his son. Their relationship, once tense and distant, had healed. They no longer talked just about business and assets. They talked about life, about the future, about the legacy that truly mattered. Lucy, who now oversaw the administrative side of the new venture, approached J.R., handing him a folder. "The first profitability reports are better than expected," she said. Her professional tone was the same, but now there was a gleam of respect and partnership in her eyes. "It seems your investment in the land was safer than any Bitcoin application." J.R. smiled. "The best investment of my life," he replied, and he wasn't referring to financial capital. Later, as the sun began to set, painting the solar panels in golden hues, J.R. found himself standing next to Abel, both looking out over the field. "Your father would be proud," Abel said simply. "Not for the profits this will generate, but for this." He gestured to the scene around them, the laughing families, the energy being generated, the future being built. True wealth isn't what you hoard in your vaults. It's what you sow in the land and in the hearts of people. It's the assets that can't be counted, but that make up a man's true net worth. J.R. looked at his hands. They were no longer soft. There were permanent calluses there, small scars that told the story of his transformation. He had finally understood what his father had tried to teach him years ago with those saplings. The white marble floor of the dealership in Manhattan still gleamed, but it was now just a workplace, not the center of his universe. The center of his universe was here, under the open sky, where the dark soil had taught him the true meaning of his inheritance. He was no longer just the heir to a fortune. He was the guardian of a history, a partner in a legacy, and the future, for the first time, felt limitless, not because of his bank account, but because of his purpose.